There exists an exhaustion that defies the restorative promise of slumber, a profound weariness that is not the residual ache of physical labor, but the subtle, corrosive saturation of the very will to be. It infiltrates the marrow of the bone not as pain, but as an ancestral fog, a specific gravity settling upon the soul that dulls the vibrant edge of perception. This is the fatigue of constant maintenance, the ceaseless silent labor required to uphold a towering edifice of self that has become unbearably heavy. The individual experiencing this malaise is often outwardly successful, perhaps even lauded for their accomplishments, yet they sense an invisible sheath surrounding their existence, a dense veil of dissonance suspended between the brilliant facade presented to the world and the disturbing, echo-filled silence residing at their core. This internal state is an artifact of profound psychic dishonesty, a continuous expenditure of energy, dedicated to ensuring that the internal architecture matches the external blueprint approved by society. The price of this meticulous staging is the slow, imperceptible erosion of authenticity. One begins to feel spectral, more a meticulously detailed hologram than a living, breathing entity. This is the antechamber to the true spiritual reckoning, a silent alarm signaling that the path of seamless appearance has reached its structural limit. In the superficial and commercially packaged spiritual circles of our contemporary age, the narrative of awakening is often painted as an inevitable upward ascent toward perpetual peace, immaculate light, and effortless transcendence. The popular wisdom suggests a simple shedding of negative influences, a purification process leading to faultless conduct. Yet, Carl Jung, the unflinching cartographer of the psychological underworld, unveiled a truth far more demanding, infinitely darker, and crucially more grounded in the gritty reality of human nature. He discerned that the terminal phase of the human journey, the process of individuation, is not concerned with sanctification. It is not about the metamorphosis into an archangel devoid of flaw or shadow. It is instead the terrifying and arduous task of becoming whole. In this audacious project of totality, the integration of all despised and neglected internal elements strikes fear into the very foundation of the human psychic architecture, more effectively than any external calamity or existential abyss. Totality demands a sacrifice of singular magnitude, an offering that the vast majority of souls, even the most dedicated spiritual seekers, refuse to lay upon the altar of transformation. This refusal is the great impediment. The required relinquishment is not merely the renunciation of obvious vices or the indulgences of a crude ego. It is the radical sacrifice of one's own innocence. It necessitates the surrender to the harrowing truth that purity, when held as an absolute achievable ideal, is a paralyzing illusion. This idealized purity prevents the soul from ever fully recognizing, much less embracing, the complete, messy, and paradoxical landscape of its own humanity. A landscape that contains both the searing brilliance of the sun and the cold, dense silence of the void. To sacrifice innocence is to accept the inherent capacity for shadow, cruelty, and ignorance, not to celebrate it, but to integrate it into a comprehensive self-awareness. The overwhelming majority of those who embark on the spiritual quest truncate their journey at what is merely palatable, stopping abruptly at the threshold of comfort. They are enchanted by the aesthetic surface of existence. They meditate until the mind achieves a temporary, pleasant placidity. They practice gratitude as a constant, self-applied balm, and they meticulously surround themselves with positive affirmations, constructing a glittering yet ultimately brittle refuge of sanitized light. They confuse this intermediate stage of superficial polishing, this skillful self-management, with the genuine, monumental labor of integration. Jung observed this pattern of evasion decades before we coined the convenient term spiritual bypassing. He witnessed, patient after patient, the seeming ascension to a state they sincerely believed to be illumination, only to recognize that they had merely erected a resplendent psychological prison, a fortress built of golden light that served the singular purpose of isolating and concealing the very darkness that was their inherent birthright. The true journey, the necessary and terrifying descent into the self's subterranean depths, had not even been inaugurated. In his most confidential journals and clinical records, Jung meticulously documented a perilous bifurcation. Some patients, through sheer tenacity and grace, managed to pierce the protective veil and advance into the final agonizing stages of individuation. Others, however, collapsed entirely, dissolving into a state of total psychic ruin. The dividing line between these two trajectories was not drawn by measures of innate intelligence, socioeconomic status, or manifest willpower. The critical demarcation was located in the individual's capacity to withstand what Jung dared to call the Great Despair. This despair is not to be conflated with the clinical condition of depression, though it can certainly mimic its symptoms. It is rather an existential suspension, a moment of seismic revelation where the entire map of one's life abruptly ceases to provide orientation or meaning. Every achievement, once proudly displayed as a hard-won trophy of competence and ambition, suddenly reveals itself to be hollow, weightless, and irrelevant. Every relationship, carefully curated and maintained through compromise and strategic performance, stands exposed as a meticulous theatrical production, a play in which the actors have tragically forgotten the original script, continuing only through force of habit. This is not simply sadness. This is the brutal, blinding awakening to the terrible realization that one has devoted decades, the full measure of one's vital energy, to living out someone else's mandated script, to dancing to the relentless, demanding rhythm of societal expectation, and to serving a role that has slowly choked the life out of the soul beneath the mask. To grasp the exact dimension of Jung's clinical discovery, it is essential to recall the austere clinical environment of early 20th century Zurich. Jung received individuals who had fulfilled the social contract to its absolute letter, careers scaled to astronomical heights, families engineered to appear model perfect, and rigorous adherence to every prescribed rule of conduct and morality. Yet they sat opposite him on his divan, describing a cavernous internal void that no medal, no financial portfolio, and no public accolade could begin to fill. These were not merely clinically depressed individuals, although they suffered immensely. They were souls in a state of profound suffocation, laboring under the oppressive, crushing burden of a life that, while flawlessly structured and magnificent from the outside, felt utterly dead, inert, and lifeless within. Jung realized that these patients were immersed in what the mystical tradition, centuries earlier, had termed the dark night of the soul. However, for the psychologist, this was not a poetic, consoling metaphor wrapped in religious dogma. It was a raw, unforgiving psychological crucible, a searing furnace that would either incinerate the individual entirely, reducing the old structure to useless ash, or fundamentally transform them into something that transcended the limited confines of the psychology of his era. The danger inherent in Jung's discovery lay precisely in this lapidary perception. The final phase of awakening is not a safe retreat. It is not a state of blissful, uninterrupted comfort. It does not manifest in incense-bathed meditation halls or during serene hikes at dawn. It erupts, violently and without apology, amidst the rubble and wreckage of one's previously constructed life. It occurs when the structure you spent years meticulously fabricating, the structure predicated on a lie, however benign that lie seemed, collapses under the sheer, unbearable weight of absolute truth. It happens when the illusion of who you pretended to be can no longer, by any application of psychic force, be sustained. The deepest, most necessary descent begins inevitably with the structural failure of the persona. We spend decades in the ceaseless, infernal forge of this social mask. The dutiful daughter, the unwavering professional, the spiritual guru, the infallible pillar of the community. The persona is designed to mediate the internal self with the external world. But through overuse and meticulous polishing, this mask fuses itself so perfectly to the skin that the individual utterly forgets that there is a distinct living face underneath. The actor forgets he is the one playing the role, believing himself to be the role. Then, often without warning, triggered by a seemingly minor event, a professional slight, a betrayal, or simply the quiet realization during an uneventful Tuesday afternoon, a subtle hairline fracture appears in the facade, initiating a process of dissolution that cannot be halted. 1152 words. The process of dissolution, once initiated by that almost imperceptible hairline fracture in the carefully constructed persona, moves with the inexorable glacial force of cosmic destiny. It is not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but rather a spectral fatigue that begins to leach the color and substance from the individual's experienced reality. The once vibrant tapestry of life, woven with threads of ambition, achievement, and social acceptance, begins to fray at the edges, revealing the terrifying emptiness of the loom itself. This exhaustion is an ontological burden. It is the weariness of the soul recognizing its own historical betrayal. It is the subtle but devastating realization that the psychic energy required to maintain the illusion To keep the mask perfectly aligned, the smile precisely curved, the posture eternally unwavering, has finally exceeded the reserves of the inner core. The individual is not merely tired from labor, they are exhausted from being. We witness this phenomenon daily, often without recognizing the profound tragedy unfolding beneath the polished surface. Consider the archetype of the successful professional, the executive whose name is synonymous with quarterly success, whose calendar is a meticulous choreography of power lunches and high-stakes decisions. Outwardly, the image is flawless. The bespoke suit fits like tailored armor. The voice projects authority. The gaze is steady, promising competence and unwavering direction. But observe him in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of the 45th floor conference room, where the light is perpetual and unnatural. He is speaking, articulating a strategy that will move millions, yet his consciousness seems to have detached, hovering near the ceiling like a ghost observing its own elaborate performance. He hears the words leaving his mouth, complex vocabulary, jargon perfectly deployed, but they ring hollow, divorced from any internal resonance. The concepts of synergy, optimization, and scaling suddenly sound like incantations in a dead language, utterly devoid of human meaning or spiritual weight. The suit, once a symbol of earned status, now feels like a leaden shroud, an oppressive weight designed not for protection but for burial. His practiced, confident gesture, the slight tilt of the head, the steadying of the hands on the polished mahogany, is no longer spontaneous. It is a mechanical movement, the pulling of a puppet string. And when the meeting concludes, and the respectful applause fills the room, that sound is not affirmation. It is the dull, terrifying echo of a prison door slamming shut on the genuine, struggling self. This is the manifestation of the invisible dissonance, the chasm between the external narrative of triumph and the internal landscape of devastation. The persona is still functioning, brilliantly so, capable of navigating the complex demands of the world, yet the human being beneath is experiencing a form of psychic atrophy. The success is real, the financial statements confirm it, the accolades validate it, but the inner self has starved to death in the process. The terror deepens when the individual retreats from the public arena and enters the domestic sphere, the very place where the mask is theoretically supposed to soften, to relax into intimacy. But in the quiet isolation of the home, the facade does not simply dissolve, it rigidifies, becoming a terrifying, impermeable shell. Imagine the evening meal. The table is set with careful attention, the lighting is warm, the conversation is predictable and comforting. Sitting across from a loved one, a spouse, a child, a deeply cherished friend, the executive attempts to engage, to connect. But as the familiar voice of his partner describes the events of her day, he feels an immense, silent chasm opening between them. The sound of cutlery against the fine china becomes deafening, an unbearable clamor that drowns out the faint, desperate whisper of his own soul. He hears himself asking the appropriate, expected questions. How was your day? Did the meeting go well? But the voice sounds recorded, played back through a hollow cavity in his chest. The effort required to maintain eye contact is astronomical, a feat of conscious willpower expended just to mimic the most fundamental human engagement. He realizes with cold, paralyzing clarity that he is not participating in his life. He is merely observing it, a spectator viewing a meticulously staged play where he happens to be the central, yet most absent, actor. The love he feels is real, the commitment absolute, yet the capacity to transmit or receive that love has been walled off by the thickness of the persona he can no longer shed. It is in these moments of profound and terrifying stillness that the truth of Jung's observation about the necessity of sacrificing innocence emerges. This sacrifice is not about becoming cynical or cruel. It is about relinquishing the childish, desperate hope that one can be purely good and perpetually safe. The cracking of the persona allows the raw, unlived potential, the parts of the self that were deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, or too wild for social consumption, to begin seeping through the cracks. This emergence of the shadow is the true source of the great despair. The despair is not merely sadness over lost opportunity. It is the existential agony born of confronting one's own duplicity, however unintentional. It is the realization that the persona was not just a protective layer. It was a mechanism of constant psychic self-betrayal. All the energy spent curating the image, the professional excellence, the moral integrity, the unshakable optimism, was energy stolen from the monumental task of living authentically. This crushing recognition often manifests physically, settling into the body with the heavy, immutable weight of geological time. The ancestral fog, the weariness that sleep cannot resolve, is felt not in the muscles strained by labor, but deep in the marrow of the bones. The individual wakes in the pre-dawn hours, not rested, but already burdened by the sheer magnitude of the day's required performance. They look in the mirror, not seeking affirmation but conducting a forensic examination of the face, searching for the telltale signs of the imminent collapse. What they find is deeply disturbing. The eyes framed by the familiar contours of the face seem alien, reflecting an anxiety that belongs to a stranger. The polished exterior remains, yet the man staring back is a ghost in expensive attire, a perfectly tailored silhouette against the dawn of a life he never chose. This is the core realization that differentiates the final stage of individuation from mere spiritual superficiality. The seekers who bypass the shadow work, those who practice gratitude as a constant balm and construct a refuge of sanitized light, fail precisely because they refuse to meet this desolate, unadorned self in the solitude of the late night. They refuse the terror of confronting the life they have ruined in the pursuit of appearing perfect. Jung understood that the collapse of the persona is not merely a psychological event. It is a spiritual cataclysm, the necessary precursor to true integration. The life that was built upon a foundation of social expectation and idealized self-image must be reduced to rubble, not by an external force, but by the gravitational pull of the neglected soul demanding audience. The individual, suspended in this terrible state of existential vertigo, stands at the threshold of the nigredo, the blackening, the phase of decomposition where all previous certainties are incinerated. Every trophy feels hollow, every relationship an intricate, fragile performance. The successful life, seen through the lens of this brutal awakening, is revealed to be inert, a polished sculpture devoid of vital force. The terror lies not in the darkness that is revealed, but in the sudden, blinding clarity that the darkness was always there, inherent to the human condition, and that all the effort of the last decades was spent trying to wall it off, rather than bravely integrating it into the terrifying, magnificent project of becoming whole. The persona has fractured, and what begins to bleed through is the immense, terrifying potential of the unlived life, demanding its due. The fracturing of the persona, that meticulously crafted carapace of social acceptability, is not merely a breach, it is a deluge. What rushes into the newly exposed inner landscape is the vast, surging tide of the shadow. This is the essential core of Jungian topography, the realization that the journey toward wholeness is synonymous with the terrifying, exigent task of confronting and integrating that which we have systematically exiled from our conscious identity. The shadow is not merely the sum of minor flaws or character defects. It is the repository of all rejected attributes, the silent archive of the psyche's potential, comprising everything deemed incompatible with the light we desperately wish to project. Within this subterranean vault reside the impulses deemed too crude, too aggressive, too vulnerable, or too intensely sexual for the stage of conventional life. But crucially, the shadow also holds the seeds of authentic power, the untapped creativity and the fierce, unyielding vitality that was sacrificed at the altar of conformity. When the persona collapses, this repressed energy, long denied its rightful place in the sunlit world of consciousness, erupts with a numinous force. It manifests first as a paralyzing self-disgust, a sudden, blinding recognition of one's own duplicity, followed by the terrifying awareness of one's inherent capacity for moral ambiguity, a capacity usually reserved for the villains in the narratives we construct for others. The profound exhaustion that permeates the bones of the successful individual, the weariness that no volume of sleep can dispel, is the chronic fatigue generated by the ceaseless labor of suppression. It is the psychic cost of holding the dam against the shadow's immense pressure. When that dam finally breaks, the individual must navigate the nigredo, the blackening phase, where the world loses its luster because the internal architecture of meaning has dissolved. The primary mechanism that protected the ego from this raw, uncensored self, the mechanism of projection, is now shattered. For decades, the individual effectively managed the darkness within by displacing it onto the external world. The rage was observed in political opponents. The greed was concentrated in corporate entities. The deceit was the exclusive property of rivals. Projection is the psychological firewall that allows one to maintain the illusion of relative purity. But in the crucible of the great despair, this firewall crumbles. The projected darkness snaps back to its origin point, forcing the soul to acknowledge, I am the source of the evil I perceive. I harbor the capacity for the very destructive forces I condemn. This realization is the true existential horror. It is the moment when the external map of morality ceases to be a reliable guide, because the landscape of the self is revealed to be infinitely more complex and morally ambivalent than any dogma allows. The self is no longer seen as a struggle between light and darkness, but as the synthesis of both, a terrifying equilibrium where creation and destruction coexist in potent, fluid tension. How, then, can the soul integrate this newly revealed, terrifying internal landscape without succumbing to paralyzing shame or psychotic fragmentation? The answer lies in understanding that integration is not about fixing the shadow, nor is it about releasing every dark impulse into the world. Integration is an act of deep philosophical acknowledgement. It is the arduous process of entering into a dialogue with the despised self, granting it an audience, and recognizing the essential energy it carries. The shadow demands not affection, but recognition. It requires consciousness to bear the unbearable truth that the quest for spiritual perfection is inherently flawed, because perfection, by its very nature, excludes the messy, contradictory reality of human experience. The seekers who engage in spiritual bypassing, the relentless pursuit of positive affirmations, sanitized emotional states, and superficial practices, seek to bypass this necessary confrontation. They are like alchemists who attempt to skip the nigredo, the blackening and decomposition, and move directly to the albedo, the purification. Jung knew this shortcut was a lethal psychological maneuver. By refusing the dirt, the contamination, and the darkness, they ensure that the shadow remains autonomous, lurking just outside the perimeter of consciousness, retaining its potential to erupt violently, usually manifesting as inexplicable self-sabotage, sudden moral failures, or chronic unresolvable anxiety. The price of true wholeness is the sacrifice of innocence, the surrender of the illusion that one is fundamentally good or pure. The truly whole person is not one who has eliminated the capacity for malice, but one who holds that capacity consciously, understanding that their moral choices are earned daily through vigilance and perpetual self-scrutiny, rather than being an innate state of grace. This is the difference between a life lived virtuously by rote, the persona, and a life lived morally through conscious, agonizing choice, the integrated self. The confrontation with the shadow is often experienced as a profound psychic nausea, a feeling of having ingested something poisonous. The previous sense of self, the idealized structure, begins to putrefy, and the individual feels stripped bare, exposed, and fundamentally unlovable. They feel the weight of every past denial, every unvoiced truth, every act of subtle cruelty perpetrated in the name of self-preservation or social harmony. This is the existential hangover of a lifetime of self-deception. If the totality of one's being includes the capacity for depravity, the seeds of jealousy, and the desire for domination, does the act of acknowledging these aspects dilute one's moral character, or does it finally provide the necessary anchor for true ethical action? Jung's insights insist upon the latter. To know the depth of one's own darkness is to gain an indispensable empathy for the darkness in others. It dissolves the self-righteousness that is the hallmark of the unexamined life. The integrated individual no longer needs to project evil onto the world, because they have taken responsibility for the evil within their own heart. This radical acceptance frees up an enormous reservoir of psychic energy, previously spent on internal policing and external judgment. The individual becomes heavier, more grounded, possessing a chthonic quality, a depth connected to the Earth's primal truths, rather than merely floating in the ethereal, disconnected space of idealized spirituality. The process of integration demands a deep, patient excavation of the personal history, seeking out the moments where the self recoiled from its own impulses. Where did the rage go when it was deemed unacceptable? Where did the desire for wild abandon retreat when the societal script demanded discipline? These exiled elements do not simply vanish. They crystallize in the shadow, often forming sub-personalities that operate autonomously, influencing behavior from the deep unconscious. To integrate them is to understand their motive, to recognize the vital need they represent, and to consciously choose a channel for their expression that is congruent with the newly emerging, broader self. The suppressed rage, for instance, is often transmuted into creative assertiveness, The exiled vulnerability transforms into profound, authentic connection. But this transmutation is only possible after the initial, terrifying realization that the rage and the vulnerability belong to the self, absolutely and irrevocably. This integration is not a tidy, linear progression. It is marked by fits and starts, periods of regression, and moments where the sheer magnitude of the task seems insurmountable. The soul grapples with the inherent paradox. How can I accept my shadow without becoming my shadow? The answer lies in the conscious holding of the tension between the opposites, the light and the dark, the saint and the sinner, a process Jung termed the transcendent function. If the most terrifying freedom is the realization that we are fundamentally responsible for the character we become, does the integration of the shadow not become the ultimate act of liberation, even if that liberation is purchased at the cost of our most cherished illusions? This freedom is not lighthearted. It is heavy, weighted by the knowledge of one's own limitations and potential destructive power. Yet, it is the only path to genuine authenticity. The true master of the self is not the one who has transcended human failings, but the one who has descended fully into them, cataloged their dimensions, and chosen, consciously, to shepherd them toward constructive ends. The individual moving through the Nigredo is preparing for the ultimate existential negotiation, the dialogue with the soul's most terrifying resident, a dialogue that must be completed before the architecture of a new, truly individual life can be raised upon the smoldering ruins of the collapsed persona. The psychic landscape has been cleared by fire, leaving only the dark, fertile ground of the unvarnished truth, ready for the painful, slow growth of the integrated self. The existential negotiation with the shadow is not a casual foray into the dark recesses of memory, but a sustained psychological immolation, a baptism by the cold, unforgiving flame of radical self-awareness. It requires the individual to sit in the sepulchral silence of the self and witness, without flinching, the full panorama of their own potential depravity. This is the moment when the seeker realizes that the monster they feared was never lurking outside the gates, but residing, comfortably and intimately, within the very architecture of their own soul. This realization carries a weight that is almost unbearable. It is the crushing recognition that every vice, every cruelty, every capacity for betrayal witnessed in others holds a corresponding vestige within one's own heart. The shadow is not merely the archive of past mistakes, it is the repository of all unlived possibilities, the paths not taken, the desires ruthlessly suppressed, the primordial instincts deemed too savage for the civilized light of the persona. To integrate the shadow is, therefore, to reclaim vast reservoirs of vital, albeit dangerous energy, that have been locked away for the sake of moral comfort. The paradox inherent in this phase is the most destabilizing force in the journey toward wholeness. How does one look directly into the face of one's own darkness, the rage, the petty jealousy, the cold indifference, without collapsing into moral nihilism? The ego, constructed meticulously upon the foundations of goodness and rightness, interprets the acknowledgement of the shadow as an endorsement of evil. It believes that to see the capacity for destruction is to become the destroyer. This is the ultimate trap of the bifurcated consciousness, the mind that insists on dividing reality into pure light and absolute dark. Ancient wisdom, echoed in the deepest chambers of Jungian thought, teaches that the true master is not the one who has eliminated the inner conflict, but the one who has learned to consciously hold the tension between the warring opposites. This disciplined holding of paradox, the saint and the sinner coexisting, the light affirmed precisely alongside the darkness, is the birth of the transcendent function. It is not synthesis, where the two are merged into a lukewarm gray, but rather a dynamic relationship where their friction generates a new third force, wisdom. This wisdom is purchased at a singular price, the sacrifice of moral certainty. The individual must relinquish the comforting illusion of their own absolute purity. This is often the point where the journey stalls for those who mistake spiritual bypassing for genuine transformation. They cling desperately to the literal edge of the spiritual shoreline, content with the aesthetic rituals of transcendence, terrified of the deep, black waters of the unconscious. They prefer the sanitized affirmations and the easy balm of gratitude over the visceral, nauseating encounter with the self as a complex, contradictory, and potentially dangerous entity. The integration demands humility commensurate with the gravity of the discovery. When the shadow is confronted, the individual must kneel before the truth of their own complicity in the human condition. They must admit that their own success may have been built upon the quiet subjugation of others, that their perceived virtues may merely be defenses against deeper fears, and that the moral judgments they mete out to the world are, in fact, projections of their own unintegrated failings. This moment of profound self-abasement is not humiliation. It is the necessary ground clearing for genuine ethical action. Only when we know our own capacity for wickedness can we truly choose goodness, not as a programmed response, but as a conscious, difficult, and weighty decision. Refusing this terrifying descent has predictable and corrosive consequences. The unexamined shadow does not simply wither away. It metastasizes and demands expression, usually through external projection. The energy of the suppressed dark side is systematically displaced onto the external world. Hence, the fanatical moralist finds villains everywhere but in the mirror. The intensely critical individual sees flaws in every colleague but exempts their own meticulous inadequacies. The zealot, blinded by the perceived light of their own virtue, justifies acts of profound cruelty in the name of a higher good. The refusal to see one's own darkness transforms the world into a massive, tormenting mirror, reflecting back the rejected elements of the self in the form of perceived enemies and societal woes. The true work of integration requires entering the psychic underworld, a journey Jung called the nigredo or blackening. This is the stage where the previous self, the persona, and its carefully constructed moral edifice is dissolved. It is a period of necessary chaos and disorientation, where old maps are useless and the internal compass spins wildly. The structures of meaning that once provided security, career identity, familial role, political allegiance, all turn to ash, revealing their arbitrary nature. This experience of dissolution, this encounter with the void where certainty used to reside, is the very essence of true, the great despair, not clinical depression, but the existential suspension that heralds the birth of the truly individuated self. It is the realization that the universe does not care about the drama of the personal ego, and that the rules one followed so diligently were often self-imposed limitations designed to prevent growth. In this despair, there is liberation. The individual stands naked before the cosmos, stripped of all borrowed authority and identity. What emerges from this alchemical furnace is an identity of profound resilience and weight. The integrated self is not lighter, but heavier, weighted by the knowledge of human complexity, tempered by suffering and imbued with an authentic humility born of recognized failure. Such a soul no longer seeks the easy light or the simplistic answers of dogma. It moves through the world with a quiet gravitas, possessing an inner stability that cannot be shaken by external opinion, because it has already faced and survived the internal collapse. The process of integration concludes not with the eradication of the shadow, but with its domestication. The wild, primal energy is channeled, not killed. The destructive potential is acknowledged and consciously directed toward creative, life-affirming endeavors. The man who truly knows his capacity for rage is the one most capable of disciplined patience. The woman who has encountered her own coldness is the one capable of the deepest, most conscious compassion. This is the ultimate lesson of the shadow. What we suppress controls us. What we acknowledge, we may master. The collapse of the persona and the subsequent integration of the shadow initiate the individual into a new realm of being, one where authenticity replaces performance. The old life was a meticulously staged play. The new life is the raw, unedited, terrifying truth. This transition marks the true end of the spiritual infancy, where the seeker sought solace and comfort, and the beginning of spiritual maturity, where the individual seeks only truth, regardless of how sharp its edges may prove to be. The psychic landscape, having been cleared by the fire of self-recognition, is now ready for the slow, arduous, and profoundly meaningful task of building a life that is truly one's own, stone by deliberate stone, founded not on external validation, but on the bedrock of integrated totality. This is the genesis of the true self, scarred but whole, complex, and finally, devastatingly real. The shattering apotheosis of the persona is not a gentle shedding of an unwanted skin. It is a violent, structural failure, a psychic decimation that leaves the individual temporarily unhoused and exposed to the fierce, unmediated reality of their own existence. The meticulously woven tapestry of social acceptability, professional identity, and familial expectation snaps under an unbearable internal tension, revealing the raw, palpitating flesh of the self beneath. This collapse is an earthquake of the interior landscape, where the foundations of self-worth, previously anchored in external validation, titles, and possessions, dissolve into dust. The individual is seized by a terrifying ontological vertigo, realizing they no longer know who they are outside of the roles they played. This structural collapse is the mandatory entry point to Jung's terrifying truth. Integration is paid for in existential currency. It is the swift, brutal end to the illusion of controlled ascent. The seeker, who perhaps anticipated a smooth transition into enlightenment, finds themselves plunged instead into a maelstrom of disorientation. The protective mechanisms that sustain decades of performance, the denial, the projection, the careful management of perception, are suddenly inert. There is no shield left. This nakedness is not symbolic. It is felt in the core of the bones, a cold, piercing recognition of the profound vulnerability inherent in being truly, unfilteredly human. The urgency of this phase derives from the sheer speed of psychological deconstruction. When the persona fails, it fails completely. The familiar gravity of the world ceases to function. Suddenly, the ambition that fueled a career feels like a hollow echo. The relationships maintained by strategic politeness become unbearable burdens of inauthenticity. The person is no longer simply tired. They are unformed. They stand in the ruins of their former life, enveloped by what Jung termed the Great Despair, a state far exceeding clinical sadness. The Great Despair is the soul's reaction to profound meaninglessness. It is the moment when the entire scaffolding of acquired purpose proves illusory. It is the paralyzing recognition that the map used for the journey was drawn by others, and the destination achieved holds no intrinsic value. It is the cessation of internal dialogue that previously justified the suffering, the sacrifice, and the relentless striving. The silence that follows is not peaceful. It is vast, accusatory, and resonant with the emptiness of years dedicated to a foreign agenda. The air itself seems heavier, saturated with the weight of unlived potential. The light of day is dulled, filtered through the thick, isolating mist of profound disillusionment. To endure this state is the ultimate test of courage. Most souls instinctively recoil from the void, rushing to reconstruct a new, albeit fragile, persona, based on a fresh set of spiritual or philosophical dogmas, a sophisticated form of spiritual bypass, attempting to fill the gap with borrowed meaning. But the true work demands remaining in the suspension. It requires dwelling in the terrifying transitional limbo, where the old self is ashes, and the new self has not yet coagulated. This limbo is an environment of supreme friction. It forces an unflinching confrontation with the shadow elements that were integrated but not yet metabolized into action. The individual sees with stark clarity the mechanisms of their own destruction, the subtle ways they sabotage joy, the deep-seated fears that dictated every safe choice. There is no longer the luxury of blaming external forces. The entire responsibility for the wreckage and for the rebuilding rests squarely on the shoulders of the isolated self. This is the moment when the transformation pivots from passive collapse to active, conscious choice. The destructive energy unleashed by the persona's demise must be harnessed. The raw, unfiltered rage, the primal grief, the deep vein of cynicism, these are not to be purged, but recognized as tremendous stores of psychic energy, previously locked down by the mechanisms of control and denial. They are the volatile chemicals necessary for the profound alchemical change. The individual, suspended in the unbearable tension of the void, begins to feel the nascent stirrings of the authentic will. This will is radically different from the ego's old ambition. The ego's ambition was motivated by deficiency, the need to prove worth, to earn love, to achieve status. The authentic will, conversely, is motivated purely by expression. It is the innate drive of the unique, integrated self to manifest its complex truth in the world, irrespective of reward or approval. This birth of the authentic will is often accompanied by an immense, almost physical pain. It is the pain of choice unconditioned. When all external structures of meaning have collapsed, what is left to guide the hand? Only the whisper of the soul's deepest, most intricate desire. To choose in this void, to commit to a path simply because it resonates with the integrated totality of the self, knowing it may confuse, offend, or alienate the surrounding world, is the ultimate act of spiritual maturity. It is the commitment to becoming a source rather than remaining an echo. The rhythm of life accelerates during this phase because inertia is no longer possible. The energy of the destroyed persona demands redirection, If it is not consciously channeled, it becomes autodestructive, leading to the total psychic ruin Jung observed in those who failed this crucible. The urgency is biological, spiritual, and psychological. Act, or be consumed by the wreckage. The true work of rebuilding, therefore, does not begin with new affirmations or spiritual retreats. It begins with tiny, deliberate acts of authenticity, chosen in the face of absolute uncertainty. It is the choice to speak the uncomfortable truth when the old self would have chosen polite silence. It is the choice to pursue the deeply meaningful, albeit financially precarious path, instead of the secure, soul-numbing one. These choices are the first stones laid for the primordial architecture of the integrated self. They are heavy, rough, and imperfect, but they possess an integrity that the polished facade of the old life utterly lacked. This is the glorious, terrifying paradox of the final phase of individuation. The collapse, the despair, the suspension in the void. These are not impediments to transformation, but the very mechanism of it. The fire must consume the old wood before the foundation can be forged in steel. The integrated individual does not emerge clean and flawless, but scorched, scarred, and infinitely more durable. They carry the marks of their descent, and these very marks are the symbols of their wholeness, the proof that they dared to look into the abyss of their own nature and found not annihilation, but the complex, magnificent, and terrifying truth of who they genuinely are. The true self is finally ready to rise, not as a perfected ideal, but as a devastatingly real presence in the world. The true self, having endured the consuming flame of the great despair and navigated the treacherous suspension in the void, does not simply reappear. It is forged anew, emerging not as a delicate, polished statue, but as a monument of primordial architecture, heavy with the gravity of existence. This integrated presence is devastatingly real precisely because it is untainted by the saccharine demands of societal expectation or the internal mandate for flawless purity. This is the individual who has ceased the exhausting labor of pretending and has finally settled into the magnificent, complex truth of their own being, the burden that sleep could not resolve, the ancestral fog of exhaustion that once permeated the very marrow of the bones, lifts not through rest but through the radical act of integration. The energy previously deployed to maintain the precarious facade, the polished persona, the flawless narrative, the carefully curated emotional response, is suddenly liberated. This massive psychic release is the first and most palpable reward of wholeness. It is the restoration of the soul's inherent economy, allowing the individual to deploy their life force toward genuine creation rather than elaborate concealment. They move through the world with a calibrated alignment, where internal landscape and external action are no longer locked in a perpetual, silent war. This is the state of earned serenity. It is crucial to distinguish this profound peace from the fragile tranquility achieved by spiritual bypassers who merely suppress their turbulence. Their calm is a temporary cessation of noise, a superficial quietude easily shattered by the smallest tremor of reality. The serenity of the integrated individual, conversely, is an unshakable ballast, a primordial anchor cast deep into the bedrock of self-acceptance. It is the peace of one who has gazed unflinchingly into the abyss of their own inherent darkness, the jealousy, the rage, the fear, the capacity for destruction, and has not recoiled, but has instead signed an arcane covenant with their own shadow. They do not seek to eliminate the darkness, knowing such an ambition is futile and delusional. They seek rather to command it, giving it a disciplined, useful role within the vast architecture of the psyche. The scars carried by this integrated self are not badges of trauma to be pitied, but topographical maps of survival and wisdom. Each line etched upon the soul, each area scorched by the intense heat of transformation, marks a point where the old structure failed and a deeper, more resilient foundation was laid. These are the proof that one has not merely read about the journey, but has made it. They are the unavoidable tax levied by existence for the privilege of becoming whole. The integrated person possesses a quiet authority, a gravitas born not from titles or achievements, but from the simple fact that they are fully present in their own skin, occupying their life with devastating honesty. They have ceased the frantic search for validation, having discovered the only authentic validator resides within. To be whole is to be terrifyingly free. This freedom manifests as an indifference to the verdict of the crowd. The integrated individual is no longer dancing to the music of social expectation. They are listening to the deep, resonant rhythm of their own internal compass. When they speak, their words carry weight because they are rooted in experience, not theory. When they act, their choices possess integrity because they are aligned with their most profound, if sometimes contradictory, values. They embrace paradox as the fundamental operating principle of reality. They are strong precisely because they allow themselves to be vulnerable. They are wise because they acknowledge the vastness of their own ignorance. They are light because they carry their own shadow. The most profound realization that dawns in this final stage is the dissolution of the need for an external mirror. The old self required constant reflection, affirmation, and comparison to define its boundaries and worth. The new self possesses a deep internal resonance that renders external noise largely irrelevant. The constant, subtle internal monitoring, am I doing this right? Do they approve? Does this look spiritual enough? Ceases. This cessation of performance is the ultimate liberation. Life, once a meticulously choreographed play, becomes a spontaneous improvisation, a continuous act of being. Mistakes are not catastrophic failures leading to shame, but essential data points in the ongoing process of learning and becoming. The integrated human is not immune to suffering. Indeed, they feel the texture of sorrow and joy with greater intensity because they are no longer buffered by the layers of the persona. However, suffering no longer carries the sting of existential despair. When the tempest strikes, the integrated self bends, but does not break, because its roots are deep, intertwined with the universal matrix of human experience. They understand that pain is an inevitable component of the human condition, not a personal punishment or a sign of spiritual failure. This acceptance transforms the nature of their emotional life. Sorrow is simply sorrow allowed to flow, teaching its lesson, and then receding, rather than being cemented into a rigid, defining identity. This journey, the descent into the shadow, the endurance of the great despair, the collapse of the persona, and the eventual forging of the integrated self, is the most crucial project of human existence. It is the slow, arduous, yet ultimately glorious task of becoming fully human, shedding the mythological ideal of purity for the reality of complex, magnificent integrity. This is not a path reserved for the saints, the gurus, or the chosen few. It is the inherent trajectory of every soul that dares to listen to the faint, persistent whisper, urging it toward authenticity. Therefore, I extend this invitation, not as a command, but as a recognition of the shared and noble task that awaits us all. If you recognize the subtle, corrosive exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure, if you feel the weight of the facade growing unbearable, if you sense the hollow echo behind the external success you have so meticulously constructed, then you stand at the precipice of the true journey. The path ahead is not paved with light and ease, but with the rough, uncompromising stones of truth. It demands courage that transcends mere bravery, requiring the radical willingness to sacrifice the comfortable illusion of who you thought you were for the terrifying potential of who you are. Do not fear the darkness that you find within. It is the rich, fertile soil from which genuine light must grow. Do not shrink from the dismantling of your established life. The true self requires the space only ruin can provide. Let us acknowledge that this work is solitary in its execution. No one can descend into your abyss for you, yet universal in its purpose. For every soul that achieves this state of profound earned wholeness, the collective human tapestry gains strength, depth, and genuine presence. Take your first step toward the inconvenient, demanding yet utterly transcendent work of becoming whole. Lay the first stone of authenticity, however heavy or imperfect it may feel, for the reward is not merely peace, but the restoration of your essential self, ready at last to stand devastatingly real in the presence of the world. Come, let us walk this path together, in the silence and the truth that resides beyond the need for pretense. Let the collapse be the beginning. Let the scars become the map. Let the devastating reality of your integrated presence be the final, magnificent affirmation of your unique, complex life. The time for performance is over. The time for being has arrived. Embrace the arduous dignity of your existence,